the Canada Water Agency, and what this means for the Indigenous peoples of Canada. This presentation was completed as part of the Aboriginal Law 702 course at Queen's University. In this presentation, I intend to explore the historical context of water in terms of Indigenous peoples' beliefs about water and its role in their customs and traditions. I will then look at how natural resources are currently governed in Canada to gain insight into why the establishment of the Canada Water Agency is so crucial. I also intend to examine the current water issues affecting Indigenous communities in Canada and consider the government's response to those issues before moving on to explore what opportunities the Canada Water Agency could provide to advance reconciliation between Indigenous communities and the federal government. On the 18th of May 2020, the Yorkton This Week published an article about the Government of Canada's announcement to create a National Canada Water Agency. The Canada Water Agency appears to be primarily guided by Canada's commitments to address climate change and water security. The intent of the government mandate appears to be to develop a national strategy to collect water data, to look at flood and drought forecasting and management, development and conservation matters, for agriculture and food production purposes, and possibly to address water disputes. The article states that Canada is the only G7 country without a national flood forecasting system, and the Water Agency is urgently needed to deal with the impacts of climate change. So how is water currently managed in Canada? The news article described the potential of the Canada Water Agency to advance cooperative federalism. There is currently an absence of a national water strategy, and this resource is presently managed through a patchwork of provincial policies. The primary piece of legislation governing water is the Canada Water Act, which has not been substantially updated since it was first introduced in 1970, and yet the provinces and territories have jurisdiction over water according to Section 92A.1 of the Constitution Act 1867. The overlap is created by nature of the federal responsibility for seacoast and inland fisheries, and Indians and lands reserved for Indians. As the purpose of the new Canada Water Agency is also to collect and track data on climate change, environmental impacts and water sustainability, this also falls under the mandate of the federal government for data and statistics collection. Provincial jurisdiction over water has meant that whilst urban centres and municipalities have adequate water management strategies in place, there is a gap in water management for rural areas that particularly discriminates against isolated northern communities and therefore the Indigenous population. Indigenous people consider water sacred because it is life-sustaining. Under Indigenous traditions, water is sentient and is considered the lifeblood of Mother Earth because of its interconnectedness to all life. Natural law highlights water as central to everything. It is one of the four elements and it must be protected and respected because it is essential to the health of the planet. Indigenous peoples' natural law recognises that water shapes the land and provides us with the gifts of the rivers, lakes and oceans, the animals that live within them, and irrigation for our food and medicine. Water also features in some Aboriginal treaties and is best reflected in the Two-Row Wampum. This conveyed everlastingness, that the nation-to-nation relationship with the Europeans was to last as long as the waters flow. Water is extremely important in customary practices amongst Indigenous peoples, as it is a central feature of ceremonies such as water ceremonies and is used for cleansing and purification such as the sweat lodge and fasting. In many Indigenous customs, women are considered the sacred protectors of water because of their life-giving role. Just as water is fundamental to life on Earth, humans are protected by water in the womb, and water is the first sign of birth. The impact of colonialism has meant that many Indigenous peoples are disconnected from their traditional knowledge and practices. Women's roles as the protectors and nurturers of water has also been lost. This issue was highlighted most powerfully by the initiation of water walks by an Anishinaabe elder from Manitoulin Island, Josephine Mandarmin, in 2003. She walked around Lake Superior to bring awareness to the issues surrounding water in Canada, such as pollution by chemicals, sewage disposal, agricultural pollution, and leaking landfill sites. Since 2003, many other communities across Turtle Island now hold annual water walks. In 1876, the government introduced the Indian Act. It is the primary piece of legislation that was unilaterally imposed upon Indigenous peoples and accounted for the assimilation policies intended to terminate their cultural, social, economic, and political distinctiveness. Though it has undergone numerous amendments, it remains largely in its original form and continues to serve as the primary document that defines the government's interaction with Indigenous peoples today. In regards to water, the Indian Act specifically outlines possession of lands on reserves, management of reserves, how reserve lands can be used by provincial and municipal governments for public purposes, farms, and band council governance. In 1999, the First Nations Land Management Act was ratified. This allows for First Nations communities to negotiate a land code to manage their own lands. A community that enacts a land code then has the authority to write laws on various aspects of reserve lands, including rights of ownership, management of national resources, environmental protection and conservation standards, and provisions of local services. The duty to consult emerged from the 2004 Haida Nation v. British Columbia case. The Supreme Court of Canada held that even before Aboriginal title has been proven, the Crown is under a fiduciary responsibility to consult with an Aboriginal community when it contemplates actions that might adversely affect their traditional lands. The duty to consult is going to be an extremely important aspect of the Canada Water Agency's creation and operations, given that water management may already be under the authority of First Nations communities via Aboriginal title, modern land claims agreements, land codes, and because of any future economic development or environmental protection projects that may be undertaken on reserve lands and traditional territories. The Safe Drinking Water for First Nations Act came into force in 2013 to allow for the development of regulations to ensure access to safe, clean and reliable drinking water and effective treatment of wastewater on First Nations lands. A special assembly of First Nations chiefs in 2015 declared that the Act was developed without meaningful consultation, is contrary to the inherent authority of First Nations governments, and does not reflect the principles of customary laws regarding water. Indigenous peoples of Canada continue to experience significant disparities in access to water and water cleanliness compared to the rest of the population. Some isolated reserves do not have indoor plumbing or running water. Many sources of water are contaminated and often located off-reserve, where the community has no jurisdiction to address the problem. Many water treatment systems installed on reserves have been poorly maintained and lack funding for upgrades and adequate training. Contaminated water is a major contributing factor to the systemic barriers faced by Aboriginal people, such as the ongoing disparities in housing, health, and economic development. There remain 61 long-term drinking advisories still in effect in February 2020. The government's goal is to eliminate the water crisis for Indigenous peoples by 2021. However, this goal only speaks to long-term drinking water advisories and fails to include short-term advisories. As of July 2020, there are 30 short-term drinking water advisories in place. The water crisis cannot be fully acknowledged without also considering the ongoing unresolved land claims or economic development projects that are negatively impacting Indigenous lands through resource extraction, ground and water pollutants. The government's response to the water inequities faced by Indigenous communities has resulted in some First Nations communities pursuing lawsuits. 4 Alberta First Nations filed a lawsuit in 2014 and the Okanagan First Nation in BC in 2019. In November 2019, a class action lawsuit was filed by the Tatasqueya Cree Nation in Manitoba, which, if certified as a class action, could apply to any First Nations communities that have experienced a long-term water advisory in effect between November 1995 and the present day. In 2010, the United Nations declared access to safe water a basic human right. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development was adopted by all UN member states, including Canada, in 2015. It is a global call to action to end poverty, protect the planet, and ensure that all people enjoy peace and prosperity by 2030. At its heart are the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Goal 6 focuses on clean water. but 15 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals include water as aspects of those goals, including ending poverty, economic growth, climate action, sustainable development, health, and life below water. Addressing the social and economic issues affecting Aboriginal people in Canada is a key priority in order for Canada to meet its targets. The establishment of the Canada Water Agency appears to be clearly linked to Canada's international commitments, and working with First Nations communities and leaders to address the disparities in wealth, health, and education will be crucial for its success. So, what does this mean for the government and the Indigenous peoples of Canada? Because their inherent right to water was never surrendered to the Crown, this is a real opportunity for the government to honour its duty to consult with Indigenous nations and involve them as sovereign partners in the Canada Water Agency. It will be important to recognise traditional lands and treaty rights and incorporate Aboriginal self-governance. A collaborative process is required in the consultation process. Beyond that, it will need to be a priority of the agency to address the water crisis already impacting Indigenous peoples in Canada before targeting environmental goals. Consultation with Indigenous communities, leaders, band councils and organisations is the first step in the creation of the Canada Water Agency, but consultation must be respectful, meaningful and ongoing, and seek to gain their free, prior and informed consent. The Government of Canada needs to make significant headway with outstanding Aboriginal treaty and land claims, as well as sufficient funding to resolve the short and long-term drinking water advisories on reserves. Federal investment in infrastructure for Indigenous communities will be essential to building relationships, as will more meaningful economic development opportunities as they arise through the agency's projects. It will be crucial to reconciliation for the government to involve Indigenous leaders in the development of policy and co-drafting of any legislation, such as amending the Canada Water Act. The employees of the Canada Water Agency should have specialised training to understand the water and land issues impacting Indigenous peoples as a result of colonialism and their special relationship with water. This should incorporate the sharing of knowledge from Aboriginal elders in an authentic manner. Aboriginal leaders and agencies should have ample representation and joint authority of the Canada Water Agency itself to advance self-determination. The government should implement a preferential hiring policy for Aboriginal staff of the Canada Water Agency, and Indigenous women need to be restored to their rightful place as protectors of water through fundamental and substantial representation at all levels.